it's time for us to kick off. And what I'd like to just start with is, letting you know, if anyone who hasn't been involved with Butter before, how you can use it. And one very simple way of doing that is by using this little flashcard. So, a challenge for you is to see how fast your fingers are with the Butter Reaction soundboard game. The way it works is on your panel, on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll have these reactions. You've either got reactions as in emojis or otherwise, and you've got soundboards. So what I'd like to do is try pressing some of those. There you go. Some of those are happening. Remember that one later because we want to celebrate Colleen's great work. You also have sounds. We'll get to those in a moment. But first things first, the challenge is, can you all try and do the same reaction at the same time? Yeah, that was an easy one. Everyone give it a thumbs up. Boom. Simple. Now, obviously, you have the soundboard, and there's lots of different sounds available. Give some of those a go. Just a warning, if you misuse those, I can turn them off. So let's save them for the right appropriate moment, all right? Now, try and test all the sounds randomly and see if you can come up with any of the secret ones. Give it a go.
Smooth.
Nice. Okay, and I have a further question for you. That's a photo of me, Colleen, and Fred at the Global Scrum Gathering conference back in Portland. I'm the one in the pink wig. Yeah. Question for you. Colleen's going to talk to us today about predictability in Agile delivery. And we'd like to know where you sit in relation to predictability in the context of Agile. Are you on the left side where things are on fire and chaotic? Or are you on the right where you are as chilled as that dog being massaged? You can share your perspective by a left click on either of those and see where the temperature is for you folks.
Looks like a pretty even mix.
It is fairly even. Some of you have got this and some of you less so. Well, hopefully Colleen can shed some light on some approaches you might be able to use. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to my co-host today, Fred, who's going to introduce Colleen.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That's like said, Chris and I, we got a chance to meet Colleen in person in Portland recently at the Global Scrum Gathering, and she is the CEO of ProKanban.org. It's a diverse and inclusive Kanban community. She's also the founder of Scatterspoke, Space for Actionable Retrospectives. She's presented and taught Agile to audiences all around the world, including most recently in London. As a coach, she's worked with a range of industries, including clients like Wells Fargo, E-Trade, Home Depot, Salesforce, Gemini, and more. She helps organizations apply systems thinking approach, something I'm very interested in, to aligning Agile methodologies end to end. Served as a board member for Agile Denver, the Agile Uprising, and the chair of the Mile High Agile Conference. Happiest in the woods, camping with her kids, and her very patient husband. It's my pleasure to welcome Colleen Johnson to the Virtually Agile Meetup to teach us about getting predictable Agile delivery.
Thanks so much, Fred and Chris.
There we go. That's a good use of the reactions. Well played.
Yes. Before we look at a bunch of slides, I'd like to invite everybody to turn their video on for a moment. And I think we should all try to practice our best Chris eyebrows. So I can't work mine independently, but I'm sure there's some of you here who might be able to. Chris, could you give us a quick lesson? I can't do it without winking. It's like, anybody? Has anybody got this down? It's a little bit like The Rock.
Oh,
I can't do it with this eye open. Oh, Fred, you're close.
Mike's pretty much got it. Mike's got it.
Yeah, you do have it. And you have the beard. Maybe that's required to get the Chris eyebrows.
A beard is pretty much essential. It weighs the one part of your face down so you can raise the other part up.
Right. Yeah, it helps. Well, it's not working for me, so there's clearly I need the beard. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. We're going to talk today about predictability. I'm going to share my screen, which means I can't see your lovely eyebrows now. But what I would love to do is Chris and Fred can help me with the chat, and you can also just come off mute and ask questions. I want to make this as engaging as possible so that it isn't boring as hell. So let's start back with this picture that Chris and Fred shared. I got to meet Chris and Fred for the first time at the Global Scrum Gathering. There was axe throwing. I think we got some tattoos. There was absolutely no alcohol involved in the making of these photos. But we got to have a great time and get to know each other there. And they invited me to join you guys today. And we started talking about what's a cool topic. What do people want to know about? And I think one of the things that we landed on here was, how do we talk about predictability? In general, I think a lot of organizations, and this was part of the State of Agile report that came out earlier this year. I think version 1 still produces that report. The number 2 reason that a lot of organizations invested in Agile and Agile practices was predictable delivery. But what's one of the things we hear the most in this space? That we can't hit dates, or maybe just that this isn't actually possible when we try to put it into practice. And so what I want to talk about today is switching the way that we think about delivery dates in Agile to something that is possible, and not just possible, but not painful. Because I think when we think a lot about dates, it usually feels like a death march to something that's not realistic. So how do we do that in a different way? A little bit about Pro Kanban. I joined Pro Kanban in October of 2020 when Dan Vacanti, you see there on the right, reached out to me and asked me to step up as the CEO. He does look a lot like Stanley Tucci. So if you've never had a chance to meet Dan in person, please promise me you'll go up to him and ask him if he's Stanley Tucci. He really loves it. And then Pratik joined us about a year ago as head of learning and business development. And we've been working together to try to bring, honestly, just a different energy to the conversation about Kanban. So focusing on things about lowering barriers to learning and trying to be more inclusive in our approach to how we build a community that's excited about learning more about Kanban. You can learn more at prokanban.org, and I'll talk at the end if you want to connect with me later with any questions. So let's talk about this first. What methods do you use to estimate when you're going to deliver something, and are they accurate? Feel free to come off mute, yell some things at me.
Cycle time throughput.
Cycle time throughput.
Monte Carlo estimations.
Yay, Monte Carlo.
Something looks a bit like this. Just a finger in the air, I guess.
Yes.
In the chat, someone said flow metrics in Monte Carlo.
Yeah, great. So this audience is going to be well versed in this. The second part of this question, though, is, are they giving you accurate dates? And I think that's the thing that we really want to focus on today. So there's a lot of methods out here. There's a lot of ways we go about estimating. I've even been part of some organizations recently that have said, you know what, we're just going to go back to estimating in hours. Like, it's the conversation we all want to have anyway. Let's just pull everybody together and try to forecast how long things are going to take in terms of hours. But the second part of this is what's important. Is it giving you accurate dates? And is it giving you the tools to have confidence that you're going to be able to hit those dates? Those usually don't go together. I heard you mention a few of these things, and these are some common estimation methods that we see in Agile. So story points, velocity, using burn down charts to track our progress. Like I mentioned, working hours, and even equating working hours to story points. And where a lot of these things start to really break down is that they require not just a lot of upfront definition, but they require a lot of time to get any level of confidence or accuracy in using them. So we spend a lot of time in story pointing with teams, but that requires that our stories are really, really written well, have a lot of detail around what needs to be built before the teams typically feel comfortable in assigning that story point value. And then we track how much work we've completed with things like velocity. But for a lot of organizations, when we're trying to figure out how much can we deliver by a certain amount of time, we base that estimate off of an average velocity. Anyone have any ideas why average might get us into trouble?
It's an average of guesses. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and what we start to see if we're looking at an average velocity is things like work that doesn't get completed inside that sprint. Maybe it started in one sprint and completed in the next sprint, starts to throw off the consistency of what our velocity looks like, right? So we might see one sprint that got a lot done and another that didn't get very much done because maybe our work is carrying over and taking longer than one sprint to complete. Not ideal, but also very realistic, right? That's a pattern I see with a lot of newer Scrum teams. And so when we start to average out this data, we're getting this weird pattern that's not really reflective of how much work is actually getting completed. Same thing when we look at burn down charts. So burn down charts give us this ideal line that often our work does not follow, and it looks like almost a stair step, or it goes straight out and then drops off like a cliff because we stay up late and try to get things over the finish line to make sure we can get things done by the end of the sprint. So what I want to introduce to you all is this concept of probabilistic thinking versus deterministic thinking. And what's wrong with a lot of the ways that we're estimating and forecasting our dates is that it's very deterministic, meaning that there's only one possible outcome. There's only one right answer. So we might say something like, whether you're forecasting in terms of sprints or you're forecasting with a specific date, we might say, we think this feature will be done by July 15th. What we want to shift our thinking to is this concept of probabilistic forecasting. So think of this like the weather, right? If you watch the weather forecasts, we see a range, first of all, of the temperature today. The high today will be somewhere between 70 degrees and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So we start with a range there. We also start to see the probability of something happening as part of that range. So rain is a great example. There is a 30% chance that it will rain sometime between 4 and 6 p.m. So we see the probability and the range. And what we start to see when we combine those things is that we're acknowledging that there's never one exact answer, right? There's never 100% chance it's going to rain at 4:05 p.m. So when we start thinking about things probabilistically, we want to think about both a range and a probability or a likelihood of that outcome. The other thing that happens, if we stick with our weather example here, is we constantly update our forecasts with new information. So we see these 10-day forecasts, right, that might look at what's the weather going to be over the weekend or going into next week. And as we get closer to that date, the forecast changes. New information comes in about weather patterns or moisture in the air, right? And they're going to give you a more accurate update as we get closer to that date. And then the last piece here is that shorter estimates are always going to be more accurate. And so closer in from a weather example is going to be more accurate than 10 days out from a weather example. The same thing is true when we think about our work items, right? So the smaller our batches, if we think about this in batch size, the smaller the scope of our features, the easier it is and the more accurate we're going to be in being able to forecast when something's going to be done. When it's a massive piece of work, it's going to be harder for us to be accurate with that estimate or with that forecast. So what does a probabilistic forecast always include? A range and a probability or a likelihood. We'll come back to this in a moment. There are 4 flow metrics. Somebody said flow metrics for their answer. So great answer on what to start with here. There 4 main flow metrics are throughput, work in progress, work item age, and cycle time. Throughput and cycle time are probably the ones you're the most familiar with, right? Throughput is just how many items did we get done, right? How many stories, how many tasks, whatever your work item is, just how many of those did we complete? You can track that daily. You can track that for a 2-week sprint, whatever your unit of time measure is going to be. Cycle time is how long did it take? How long did it take for us to complete one work item from when it started to when it finished? And then we look at work in progress and work item age. Work in progress is how much work is started but not finished. This is not the sum of your WIP limits, unfortunately. This is how much actual work is in progress. And so if you're under WIP or over WIP, we want to count that number. This also means that your work in progress amount may change day to day, right? Depending on how much work is in your system. And when we talk about work in progress as a metric, that's what we mean, actual work in progress. The last one here is probably the most important metric that you've never heard of or never used, and that is work item age. So for an item that has started but not yet been finished, how old is it at this point in time? If you're using Jira, as I know many of us are, Jira gives you these very worthless dots at the bottom of each card that turn red as your work item ages. I think it was a nice attempt to help us see this, but it is not super productive in leading us to good conversations as a team. So when you think about work item age, what we want to see is, when did we start this ticket? For a lot of teams I work with, I have them put the date they pulled a ticket into in progress in front of the Jira ticket description, so we can see which tickets are the oldest as we do our daily syncs. So as you look at these 4 flow metrics, a couple things to consider. 2 of these metrics, throughput and cycle time, are on work that's completed. That work's already done. Work in progress, the amount of work in progress, and the individual work item age of a ticket are both metrics that are current work. This is work that's active, right? And so as we start to talk about how we manage work towards a date, we want to really focus on those 2 in the middle, work in progress and work item age, because that's the stuff that we can affect the most, because it's not done yet. So Fred, I think you said something about Monte Carlo simulations.
I did.
Monte Carlo simulations, if you're not familiar, are it's a modeling tool, really. It's a way that we can model out a bunch of different data together to say, what are all of the possible outcomes here? And all you need to do this is throughput data. Typically so there's lots of tools. We'll look at one here in a minute, but you can do this in a spreadsheet even. When we teach our metrics for predictability class, we actually model out the Monte Carlo all using an Excel doc. And what we do in that is we say, for a team, maybe over a 2-week period of time, including weekends, how much work was completed each day of that 2-week period. So maybe day 1 was 0, day 2 was 0, day 3 was 1 ticket, day 4 was 2 tickets, right? And so we start to just fill in these numbers here of how many items did we complete. What the Monte Carlo does then is randomizes that data and runs 10,000 instances of that data to start to model out how many work items could you get done for a given period of time. Now, if you're doing this in Excel, we often do this with a dice roll, right? We assign the throughput to a dice roll, and then we go through and roll the dice, right? We roll the dice another 20 times to say, how many times do we get each throughput value? That randomizes the data for us. And then we can run that multiple times through a macro in Excel to start to model out all of those different scenarios. Now, probably not likely that you're going to spend the time rolling the dice a million times to get to your Monte Carlo simulations. We'll take a look at how the tools do it here in a moment. But there's 2 possible ways to look at a Monte Carlo simulation. One is when, and the other is how many. So if you're looking to say, when can I get a certain amount of items done, you would look at inputting the number. So I'm going to say this feature has 25 stories in it. Tell me when this feature would be completed. The other option is if you have fixed dates or fixed release dates, or you could even use this for sprint planning to say, how many items can this team get done within 14 days? And that will tell you maybe this team can get 8 to 10 stories done with an 85% likelihood in 14 days. So you can run your Monte Carlo in 2 different ways. This is a screenshot from a tool called Actionable Agile. There are others out there that do the same thing. And you can see here at the top, all these up and down things that you see here are showing you daily throughput. So the vertical axis that says 0 to 7 is how many tickets were completed on any given day. Any ideas across the bottom where you see the groups of 2 dots on the 0 line? What's going on there? The dogs know. The dogs know.
Sorry, I just want to ask. You've been talking a lot about items. I know a lot of people deal with points. I don't know if you could touch that later, but you mind walking us through why we're talking items versus points?
Yeah, definitely. So when we're talking items, we're talking about work items. And one of the biggest shifts in from a Kanban perspective and forecasting this way with work items is we want to make sure each work item is as small as possible and still independently valuable, right? And so your items can be user stories and defects and tech debt. We're lumping it all together and just using a generic backlog. You know, if you're familiar with the Scrum Guide product backlog item or PBI. So any items that move through your system are what we're counting here. And we're not looking at all at the story point value of those items. Now, I'll show you, I'll have to wait until we're done through the slides, but I can show you a quick view looking at some teams that have tracked the cycle time data alongside their story point data. And I think there's some interesting patterns that tend to emerge that would maybe challenge your assumption that the story points come out to any kind of size or similar cycle time data anyway. But for this view, we're only looking at throughput. And so we're only looking at the count of items completed. There's no association at this level to story points. Does that help, Fred?
Absolutely. I've found similar things in my own investigation prior to learning about some of the flow metrics. It's too complex to think about points, and it doesn't matter. We did have another question in the chat, which was about team stability. How does that affect our ability to be predictable?
Yeah, what's interesting here, so we're not going to talk a ton today about system stability, but if we go back, let me go back to this view here. When we talk about flow and finding system stability, the thing we typically focus on here is the work in progress. And so what we want to try to keep stable is the amount of work that we have in our system. Now, that could vary if your team changes in size. But if it's like, well, Fred's going to go over to this team and Chris is going to come to this team instead, and the amount of people on your team is staying consistent, your work in progress amount will probably stay consistent too. Where you tend to see a relationship there between team size and the amount of work in progress is if your team is growing or shrinking in terms of the amount of people doing the work. From a Kanban perspective, though, we're really trying to look at system stability versus team stability. So how much work do we have in progress at any given time, and how are we making sure that that's not going from 2 today to 12 tomorrow to 4 the next day? Because what you start to see is things like work item age and cycle time have a direct impact or directly impacted by that amount of work in progress. Great question. I don't know who asked that one. Does that help?
It was Dave, and I think it was a very good answer. All right, but we can go ahead and continue probably.
All right. So if we go back to this one, I was asking, you'll see some patterns here where there's 2 dots together and 2 dots together and 2 dots together. Any idea what's going on there?
Are you looking at the first chart, Colleen?
Yeah, the top one, selected throughput. Yeah, somebody said weekends. That's exactly it, right? And so from a forecasting perspective, we always include weekends, both in our throughput and in our cycle time. And the main reason here is when we're forecasting and we're trying to think about when we're going to deliver something, the customer doesn't care if it's business days or working weeks or man hours, whatever you want to call it here. They just want to know when they're going to get what they asked for. And that means we need to include weekends in our forecast here. So it is reflected in the dates that we're predicting. So what happens here, the top line here is actual data. For this tool, it's being pulled out of Jira. And it's telling you the throughput per day for the team. Same thing here, it's just a bigger date range across the bottom where you can see what that daily throughput trend line looks like. So this is the same data set in the top chart and the bottom chart. But where this gets cool, is the chart at the bottom. So this is where it starts to run the trials. It's going to take the throughput you selected and run this through 10,000 trials. For this team, we wanted to know how many items could we complete in 20 days. So what you can see here is this is a randomization of how many items would be completed in 20 days. And you start to see this curve here. What you can see here, and you can't see behind this box, is there's percentile lines. So you can see 50 in the middle, 70% here. There's an 85th percentile line and a 95th percentile line behind this box. What this is telling us is the likelihood, right? The probability. So it's looking at all of the trials and drawing that line at the 95th percentile of the distribution of the outcomes. And that is going to land here at 25 days. So there's a 95% chance that this team could complete 25 items or more, that's our range, in the next 20 days. What if I lowered the likelihood? So what if I said the 70th percentile? What's my range of items I could complete with 70% likelihood?
33.
Yeah, 33 or more, right? And so we're starting to say, what's the likelihood here? So we have a probability and a likelihood. So we're always going to have that, a probability and a range. So we always want to express our forecasts with those two things. Now, if we went with the 50th, right, we can see that the amount of items that we're projecting to complete goes way up, but our likelihood of hitting that number is cut in half. But this is often what we're looking at when we're forecasting with an average, right? There's a 50% chance that we could be wrong. So how does this look when we start to communicate our forecasts like this to our stakeholders? It looks something like this, right? So we're starting to use our cycle time, and we can say, how can we start to tie together this Monte Carlo forecast with how long it takes for us to complete our individual work items? And so in that last example, this team may say, based on our team data, there's a 95% chance we can complete 25 items or more in the next 20 days. But what is the team going to do with this? Well, the team is going to take this data and set what we call a service level expectation. And that means based on the team's cycle time, so now this is where our cycle time data comes in, how long will it take for us to complete an individual work item? So the Monte Carlo gives us multi-item forecast. Our service level expectation starts to give us our single item forecast. And this is what the team has now to act on. So if this team can say 85% of our work items are completed in 14 days or less, they can start to use their past data of how long things were taking to complete to help them start to manage their work in progress. So this concept of a service level expectation is now based off this cycle time data. So we have our forecast from our Monte Carlo, which is helping us figure out our range and our probability of hitting a specific date. And then to manage the work day to day, we want to start to use this SLE. One of the things I hear the most from teams about dates is they get set and then the team feels really powerless to do anything to hit that date. Creating a service level expectation starts to give the team, think of this as your oh shit meter, right? Like this is your signal that the team needs to do something. So if the team was using this information to say 85% of our work items will be completed in 14 days or less, if work items start taking more than 15 days, you know that the team needs to take some action on those things. And that's where that work item age visibility becomes really important. So once you have your ability to forecast using your Monte Carlo, you want to start to incorporate this concept here of a service level expectation so that the team has a way to react, right? The team has a way to take control of things that seem like they might be taking too long. So we just talked briefly about the question came up around team stability. When we think about this concept of stability, I mentioned work in progress is where we really focus on stability. And to have predictable delivery, we need to have stability of our work in progress. This comes from a concept called Little's Law, which tells us that the average WIP equals average cycle time divided by average throughput. And unfortunately, that's not a sexy equation that you can plug the numbers into and get the ideal amount of WIP for a cycle time or vice versa that you're trying to achieve. But what this does start to show us is of those three numbers, what's the lever that your team has to pull to affect cycle time and throughput? And that is the amount of work that you have in progress. And so this can take some work. It can take some time to find the optimal amount of work in progress for your teams. And it's typically a little bit of trial and error. So coming up with WIP limits, agreeing to follow them, that's the second part. Agreeing as a team to follow them, and then measuring what does this do to our throughput and our cycle time. I usually try to encourage teams not to change their WIP more than every 2 weeks, just so they're getting a chance to see the impact of that amount of work. And then asking the team, right? This is a great retrospective topic. Did it feel like there were moments where we didn't have anything to work on? Did it feel like any work came into the system where we were not able to pull it in because we were already at capacity? But right now, a lot of organizations are having to figure out how to do more with less people. And this is a really important factor, I think, for a lot of organizations in making sure that they're still getting high quality work through in a reasonable amount of time by managing this amount of work in progress.
We have a question in the chat,
Yeah.
Colleen. Jovan asked, how much past data do we need in order to start to be able to make these predictive forecasts? Is there
Yeah,
kind of
great
like
question.
general guidelines?
Yeah, so for the throughput data that you'll need to run your first Monte Carlo, you only need about 10 days worth of data. Now, one thing that's really important when you're forecasting is that you want your data set to try to reflect the type of work that you're using going forward. So if it's the team superheroes, you want to forecast using team superhero data, right, from the past around their throughput. Now, what I want to forecast how we're going to be delivering in March with data from December 25th to January 5th, right? Probably not. So you want to try to get like for like data when you're forecasting that's reflective of the future work and the future, maybe the future technology they're going to be working in. And the more data you have, the better eventually, but you really only need 10 data points to get that first Monte Carlo running. Same thing is true with cycle time. And, you know, looking at those percentiles for cycle time data, you really only need 10 items completed to see those percentiles show up on your cycle time scatter plot and figure out what an ideal SLE is.
Very good.
Less
Thank
than you think.
Yeah, I've used 6 iterations as kind of like my rear view, just when I've done it.
Yeah, and we'll talk here in a minute about continuously reforecasting, but like that weather example we were talking about at the beginning, we have a tendency to come up with a forecast and then never revisit it and then burn everybody out trying to hit it. And so what's important here is that we're coming back to that forecast to make sure that based on new data coming in, which could be team changes, it could be WIP changes, it could be our throughput data is starting to change because half of our team is out for summer vacation, right? Those things are all going to impact that forecast. And so having a way to keep going back to it and rerunning it is really important. And that's where I think it's awesome to get familiar with what's happening behind the scenes in these tools, running them manually in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's probably not going to serve you well long term for the concept of continuously reforecasting if you have to do it manually every time. Great questions. So as we start to think about how we're expressing our forecast here, I'm throwing around a lot of percentages, right? There's a 50% chance, there's a 75% chance, there's a 95% chance. You'll see there's never an 100% chance when we're forecasting. What's an interesting way to think about this is based on your industry, what is your risk tolerance for being wrong with this date? You'll see for a lot of Kanban coaching and Kanban examples here, we tend to use the 85th probability as kind of our default for a lot of these things. And that means that 15% of our work might not hit that SLE or might not hit that forecast accurately. You can always go up to a 95th% probability to reduce the chances of being wrong, but it's going to either move out your date or decrease the number of things that you might be able to get done. And so when we start to think about these things, we always want to look at it from the perspective of what's our tolerance, what's our risk tolerance here for this not being accurate. And I find most organizations are pretty comfortable around that 85th percentile mark. But what's interesting here is it's just switching that language of how often can we be wrong with our data. It drives a really powerful conversation with stakeholders around how often do we need to be right here. And like I said, we never forecast to 100% accuracy, right? That's the deterministic way of forecasting, where in this case, we really want to stay focused on that probability and the likelihood. Any questions on this part? This is where I think it gets really fun thinking about risk.
I think it's great to think in that reverse. I mean, I know Chris has talked in the past about the whole concept, like in a meeting or retro silence compliance. You could say silence is disagreement, where you get people to think about it a little bit differently and force them to look from the other side of the page.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot in our forecasting classes about this concept of risk tolerance, and different causes of variability. And there's common cause and special cause variability. Without going too far down that rabbit hole, we want to think about how we can manage risk versus mitigate risk. And I think a very simple way to think about the two different types of risk that may be introduced in your system, or to think about your drive to work. Although I don't know, that might be an outdated example these days since we're still mostly at home. But if we were thinking about that likelihood of hitting a date or managing our drive against past cycle time data, right? What's our SLE for getting to work? Well, maybe 85% of the time, it takes me 30 minutes or less, right? So most of the time I can get to work in 30 minutes. What kind of risks might come up in my commute to work? Well, there's some risks that come up that are common cause, right? Things like it might snow, it might, there might be an accident that could slow things down. So if I have an important meeting, I might say, I want to move up my likelihood to 95%. And that means I only have a 5% chance of being late, but I need to leave an hour early instead of 30 minutes early. When we talk about mitigating risk, though, these are the things that we often can't do through simple process changes, right? Managing risk, we can usually control through process change or workflow policy changes. When we talk about mitigating risk, these are things that are a lot harder. So if I take the light rail or the tube to work and something derails, what am I going to do then, right? Well, maybe I'm going to decide I'm just going to permanently work from home and never have to commute again. But these are mitigations, tend to be changes to how we work versus the small changes that we make to process and workflow. So as we start to think about how we forecast, we want to also start to think about, as an organization, how do we manage versus mitigate the risks that might come up? And that's a great conversation to have, like you just said, Fred, around how often can we be wrong? And then how can we reduce the likelihood of things happening that are going to cause us to be wrong with our forecast? The other piece of this that I mentioned is this concept of continuously reforecasting. What kind of things would be a trigger for reforecasting? Well, it turns out quite a few. Changes in scope is probably the one we're the most familiar with. So if I forecast a date range based off of a certain number of stories, I use that example at the beginning of this feature's got 25 stories in it. Well, I don't think I've ever been part of a delivery effort that had ended with the same scope it started with. So while this can be a good conversation to have with your product folks, to be able to say, hey, we forecasted based off 25 stories in this feature, and now there's 30, that can turn into a little bit of one in, one out for your product owner or your product manager to say, okay, in order to keep this date, we need to pull 5 stories out and keep our scope at 25 stories. Or it can mean we're going to reforecast based on 30 stories. A lot of times I like to look at the percentage of change in scope if you have enough historical data, so that you could say, it looks like for the past year, every feature that we did had about 10% growth from the starting count of stories to the finished count of stories. And that way you can forecast with both numbers. So I can forecast a date for delivery with the starting number of stories in the feature and add 10% and see what that number comes in at, and then use that as my new range, right? So changes in scope, I think, are the biggest trigger for reforecasting, the one we're the most common or the most familiar with. The next would be capacity. Who's been part of a layoff recently? There's a lot of them taking place right now, especially in the States. So when we think about this concept of continuously reforecasting, we want to think about the capacity our organization has to do the work. So team changes, right? We talked about the size. Our capacity from a Kanban perspective is often reflected in the amount of work we have in progress, right? So that's how we're monitoring or metering the amount of capacity that a team has, or a system or a portfolio has, as through that work in progress limit. So as our capacity changes, or our WIP goes up and down because of the amount of people doing the work has changed, that's definitely a trigger to reforecast. And the last one here is speed. So if I'm looking at my board as a team and I see that half of the items on my board have exceeded my SLE, right? And my SLE is set off of an 85th percentile. That means half of the items have aged past that SLE, and my cycle time data is going to start to get worse, or it's going to start to increase. So my speed is going down essentially, or my cycle time is going up. That would be a trigger for reforecasting. Same thing if my cycle time's getting better, right? Some teams get faster as they start to measure and track all of these things. That would be another trigger to reforecast your data. So what does this look like, right? Let's say this was our forecast. There's a 56% likelihood that we will deliver between August 1st and August 4th. So one of the things that I think can be really, I guess, a little bit of a thorn in my side when it comes to Agile practices is that we have a tendency to constantly switch the dates, right? It'll be done at the end of the sprint. No, actually, it'll be done at the end of the next sprint. No, actually, we missed that sprint. It'll be done at the end of the next sprint. When we're reforecasting work here, we want to shift the conversation to be about changing the percent likelihood. So maybe I started this forecast with an 85% likelihood that we will deliver between August 1st and August 4th. But as we've added more scope, I'm going to decrease the likelihood, but not change that date. So as a leader in this organization, the conversation then becomes, with the new scope added, are we comfortable with this new probability? Is this a risk we're willing to take, right? Are we comfortable with the fact that there's only a 56% likelihood that we will hit that original date? That's going to drive a much different conversation than now our date's August 15th. Oh, now our date is August 25th, right? Seeing that date constantly move feels like we're locked into that decision. We're changing this percentage about the probability of hitting that date is going to start to drive a different conversation around mitigating risk. So this is a fairly outdated view here, but this is a dashboard that Pratik had built for a previous employer where he was tracking a few interesting things here, right? So he was running behind the scenes each of these teams' data of what their original forecast was and what their current likelihood of completing the feature was based on their throughput data. So if you look at this, you can see if we go across the top, here's the team name, here's the release they're targeting and code freeze date, here's how many stories are remaining for them. So how much scope do they have? The 85th% likelihood of hitting this, or getting this work done was January 25th. The current likelihood of hitting that date is down to 37%. So what is that going to do as a team? What kind of conversation are you going to have? How many stories could we cut out if it's still really important we hit that 125 date? Pratik built this in a way where it was color coding each of these different teams' data so that it was, I think, like you can see the yellow is 80th percentile. Things that are in green are still above that 80th percentile line. So it's telling you those all look good. Look down here, tax management platform. That was targeted to be delivered with an 85% likelihood on November 15th. It now has less than a 0.01% chance of hitting that date. So what we're doing now with this data is we're changing that completion likelihood so that we can have a conversation about, is this risk something we're comfortable with? Or do we need to have a conversation about changing scope or pace or capacity? I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions on this concept, because I know it's a big shift from how we typically do dates.
I would say I love it. Oh, hey, Mike, you got a question? Feel free to unmute and ask.
So yeah, I'm just curious whether there are any AI tools that can be done for continuous reforecasting.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, a lot of what we do in class is done through Actionable Agile, as I mentioned, and there are a couple other versions of tools that do similar Monte Carlo forecasting. Now, this one I think is pointed at Actionable Agile data, and it's just pulling them over into this dashboard view of all the different projects together. I don't know of any AI tools that do it, but there's space, feels like, to create something.
Business opportunity for somebody.
I know.
I was about to say there's an opportunity there, Mike.
59 people have heard it now, so jump on that one. There was another question or backlog or in the chat, which was about the kind of work. And as we know, our teams are often do various kind of things that maybe don't lead to, working on this hiring integration. How do you kind of account for those spikes, research, monitoring tasks that a team might do to help predict?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that question, right? That's why we focus just on work items and not trying to segment all of the different types of work items and saying, you got 5 user stories and 3 defects and 2 tech debt, right? It's just how much work did we get done? What's nice about lumping all of this into one bucket is we start to get an accurate reflection of the work that team is doing, right? If the past data reflects the forecast in the future. Now, what's important here is we see a team name here. So what each team is working on and when, what's their chance of hitting this release date. However, if your team is working on more than one feature at a time, you're going to want to make sure you forecast those features at all of those stories together, right? And so that's where, again, I'm not paid by Actionable Agile, but they do have a cool portfolio forecaster in their Jira plugin that gives you the ability to say at an epic level, what's my forecast look like for hitting this date with one epic? But if my teams are working on 3 epics at the same time, how does that impact my forecast? Because it does, right? This is assuming that we're working on, like that top line you just called out, Chris, for hiring integration, there's 12 stories, here's our forecast, or 12 items that this team has left to do. It's assuming that's what we're working on, those 12 items. From a cycle time perspective, what is great about cycle time data is it's including all of that stuff that's hard to account for. So a lot of times when we're trying to do sprint planning, right, we're like, well, we want to leave 30% of our capacity for unplanned work or defects, right, or whatever that magic number is going to be that we're going to guess and try to reserve. When we're using cycle time data, that number is reflective of all of the stuff that comes to your team all the time that's hard to account for. So I always like to use this example of painting the bathroom. If I asked everyone on the phone, like, how long is it going to take to paint, will you come paint my bathroom? You might be like, there's barely 2 walls. One's a shower, one's a door. We can have this done in 2 days. And I'm like, great, go paint. You get in there and you're like, oh, I have to take the medicine cabinet off the wall and I have to tape all these stupid corners around the bathtub. And it's wet in there. So I'm going to do 1 round of paint and then I have to wait 2 days and I'm going to do 1 round of paint. And you're not going to have your bathroom back for 6 days when it's all said and done. The same thing happens when we ask everybody to estimate things up front, right? Whether it's points, whether it's hours, we're thinking about how much time am I rolling paint? How much time are my hands on the keyboards doing this one part of the system or one part of the process that I own? We're not thinking about drying time and handoffs and the time that it waits for code to get picked up and merged, picked up and tested, all the stuff that turns our 2-day estimate into 6 days till it's done. So what's really great about using all this real data is it's including all those things, right? So we've got that reflected in our cycle time data and reflected in our throughput data. It's a very long-winded answer.
But it's very good. But anyone who's had a bathroom model knows it takes 2 years from when you started.
Absolutely. Okay. So all of these things we're talking about, right? And all of this data, our goal with all of this is to drive our team to some action. And so when you think about all of the metrics that we talked about, work item age, work in progress, those are things that give the team something to respond to right away. So work in progress helps us manage that consistent amount of work and keep our system stable. Work item age helps us see which items are starting to age past an unreasonable amount of time so that the team can swarm around them. Cycle time and throughput metrics, they're work that's done, right? I can't fix cycle time data because it's work that's completed. I can't change throughput data. That's already in the past. But those are great conversations for retrospectives, as I mentioned. And those 2 measures tend to be great conversations for process improvements, workflow policies, working agreements, right? So looking at that data helps drive those improvements to how your team is working together. You can start to measure these things without changing your process at all, right? You can use all 4 of these measures if you're using Scrum, if you're story pointing, right? And just start to pull them in to the practices that you already have. We touched on this a little bit, but using data you already have is going to include all that variability we just mentioned with the bathroom example. My favorite thing when working on bigger projects or bigger initiatives, has anybody worked in an organization where there's a buffer? It's like, we got this estimate based off velocity, but we're going to add 30% because the team's always wrong. And that 30% is just like some magic wand number. for unplanned work. But when we start with all this existing data, that's actual data from the teams, it's going to include all these things, right? It's going to include variability, unplanned work, wait time. I think, like I mentioned, if you're looking at the calendar impact on the time of year, it can be useful to pick the throughput data that is reflective of where you are right now. So if you can forecast work for the summer months with work from last summer's months and similar, and know that your system is stable, you're going to have a good representation of things like vacation or holidays that may come up this time of year. Same thing with end of year, or include the whole year, right? The more looking at that full set of data is going to give you more of that variability baked in. That's everything I have for you guys. I would love to open it up for questions before I drop the screen share. If you want to learn any more about ProKanban or any of the classes we offer around forecasting and using metrics for predictability, or using flow metrics for Scrum teams, check us out at prokanban.org. Stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Colleen. I learned so much in this. I mean, on my Remarkable, I actually have a couple of Dan's books on there that I'm going to be when will it be done is I think I'm going to plan on reading at the airport today because I'm leaving for a flight soon. So I can learn more about this. But let's open up to the audience. Like you heard a lot. Some people asked in the chat, but unmute and, ask some questions.
I'm still a bit blown away by all this. Wow, that's a lot of data coming in. And I can see how this is really helpful in a sense. And it also gives me this weird gut feeling that it is a way of getting management to claw back some control about the whole process. And it's just, I don't know what that was. But I don't know. Is it? I don't know. It just feels a bit unhuman to try and put it all into these metrics and all these percentages. And what would you say to that? I mean,
yeah,
it's a weird feeling, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is a lot. And start with one thing, right? Start with running the Monte Carlo. I think a great way to introduce this is to not change anything that you're doing, like story point, come up with dates based off velocity or however you're doing it now, and then go through running the Monte Carlo at the same time. What happens a lot when you start putting this data in front of the team is they go, that's fucking wrong. There's no way it takes us that long. We'll be done next week. This is saying we won't be done till the end of August. That's ridiculous. And then as you can start to show them both sets of data, they're like, oh, damn it. This was a long time, right? And so I like to do both so that nobody feels like you're saying, hey, you guys suck at forecasting or estimating. But show them both sets of data and start to bring them along so that you can show them the story and show them that continuous reforecasting model as they're doing work, and give them something to react to. So I think that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Carolyn, you had a question.
Yes. Hi. We are currently using flow metrics and actionable agile. We're having a hard time with adoption on the teams, but every time we mention that eventually they won't need to rely on story points, they about have a coronary, because they're so attached to velocity and story points. They don't realize that that's really just a feeling about complexity, because they've been using it for so long, and that's what we were originally taught. And Jira actually kind of extrapolated that push for that until they upgraded some of their metrics, but still not good enough. So we've been trying to take baby steps, and every time we talk about velocity versus flow and cycle time, throughput, all that, we're trying to help them see the benefit. Some teams are getting on board faster than others, but how can we help those who are not familiar yet with flow metrics? What's the best way to help them see that story points are kind of a thing of the past and flow metrics is where it's at?
Yeah, so I think a great way to do it is to start, if you're using Actionable Agile, there's a setting in Actionable Agile where you can color code the dots on your cycle time scatter plot by different things. Do it by story points, right? And then you can show that there's 3-point stories that take 3 days, and there's 3-point stories that take 20 days. And so that starts to create a real visual around the variability and the point value versus the time it takes to do, the time it takes to deliver each story. I think that's a great conversation driver for the team. And And maybe your team will have a magic scatter plot where you'll have a band of 3 points and a band of 5 points. I've never seen it shake out that way. And so I usually use that as a way to say to the team, is the time we're investing in story pointing giving us the outcomes that we want, right? Is it reflecting the time it takes us to do any of the work, or helping us forecast how long things take from a planning perspective? And I think that can be a great conversation. Now, the flip side of this, what I've seen a lot of teams do is get really excited that we're going to pull a meeting off their calendar and go, great, we don't have to ever talk about stories again. We'll just pull them in and start the work. And then stories come into in progress and the team doesn't know anything about them. They haven't had a conversation about acceptance criteria. They haven't reviewed they haven't had that conversation that used to take place in story pointing, and everything gets stuck in the first column on your board. And so I think one thing that's always important when you're thinking about the story pointing piece is a lot of meaty conversation happens there about how to break the stories up and how to, how are we going to work on this? How are we going to approach it? You don't want to lose that necessarily, but is the point, like, can we detach ourselves from the point value that comes out of it? And I think that's where looking at your scatter plot could help.
That's a great tip. I love that one. That's going to help me when I try out Agile Module this summer. Mark, you're up next with a question.
Hey, this was great, Colleen. So, question, any advice you have for teams that get caught up in the analysis paralysis of creating these small, so to make this run, you really need to have your stories created up front, right? So that you can, to some extent, as much as you know, so that you can start tracking how much you have left. But for teams that aren't used to doing that, they can get stuck really easily and just sweating the details and just taking a long time to get those small stories.
I think as much as possible when we're like a lot of this process is also going to make it easier for you to not have to do a bunch of upfront definition. But another way to think about that is that this is setting you a budget for scope, right? And so if you can you could build a scatter plot based off your past feature size, where you're saying for all the features or all the epics this team has completed, how many stories were in each one? Well, the 85th percentile tells us that 85% of the features that we completed had somewhere between 12 and 18 user stories in them. So use that data to give yourself that budget to say, we're going to forecast off of 12 to 18 user stories, even though none of them are written yet. And now as a product owner, I have a rough idea of if the size of this feature is consistent with the size of our other features, here's the date that we're going to hit. But if I go over 18 stories, we need to reforecast. And you can do that without having any stories written. So I look at it almost as like budgeting, helping the PO budget a little bit of the scope up front.
Thank you. All right. Susan, you had a question.
Hi there. I don't have my videos on. Hello. So this is really great timing because I'm trying to adopt this actually and using flow metrics. Just got a lot of people to convince. And I've got a meeting next week, so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you so much. But there was a couple of things I'm trying to iron out. So first of all, about the epics, you did touch on that. So we have a number of epics. I know some people might use them as features, but where we're working on at the same time. So how could I use the Monte Carlo to say like when will something be done if we've got a couple of tickets from this epic, a couple from this one? I think you mentioned that earlier. There might be something actionable Agile.
So there's a couple things. If you're using Actionable Agile with the Jira plugin, it does this for you. It has it's called a portfolio forecaster, and it will adjust the dates based on how many epics you're running in parallel. If you're doing this manually, which, like I said, can be really hard, the way I typically do it, and it's messy as hell, but I would say based on the scope of these 3 epics that we're going to be working in parallel, what's the total amount of stories for all 3 epics? Dump all of that into one Monte Carlo, right? And then you're going to have one date for all 3. You could forecast each of them independently, but it's going to depend, like that's assuming focus on them serially instead of all at the same time. So when I know that a team is split across multiple features or multiple epics, I forecast them as one big chunk of work. The downside of that, like we said at the beginning, the more stuff in your batch, the more inaccurate your forecast is going to be. So smaller batches are always going to give you a more accurate forecast. So if you can get the team to think about limiting WIP at that epic level. That's going to help.
Yeah, great. And also just quickly, I've heard a lot about right sizing. You didn't really touch on that, and that's the thing that's really confusing me right now, is how do we know we can get it done in a sprint? Do you use that? You can get a certain amount of work done within 85% or something. Was that right?
Yeah, so that concept of your service level expectation is really how you start to right size work. We say right size versus same size, because if we tried to same size everything, we would end up with really poorly written work items, right?
Yeah.
Everything has to be 7 days. You're going to have things that we're creating dependencies, or we're making work too big or too small. And honestly, your cycle time would start to go up because we're sizing the paint. We're sizing our work of rolling the paint to 7 days, and we're not accounting for all the wait time in our system. That's probably going to make that number increase. So we say right size. It's just really a gut check to say, if 85% of our work is done in 7 days or less, when we're pulling stories into the system, does this feel like it can be done in 7 days or less? So it's just that upper threshold. Not everything will be a yes. So that's your 15%, right? Is this one of the acknowledging it's going to probably take us 12 days? So it's really just a quick gut check for the team to say, is this as small as possible and still independently valuable?
Yeah, because we're trying to. Oh, I realized my camera's not on. Sorry. Hi. Because sorry to keep talking, but because I've got lots of questions about this. Yeah, because I'm worried because we're trying to move away from time estimates for various reasons, and I'm just worried that that kind of right side. Oh, can we get this done within this many days? Is kind of similar to that, and I'm a bit worried. People might make comparisons, and we're trying to move away from it.
Yeah, I usually I focus that if you've used invest criteria at all, I just focus that on, is this as small as possible and still valuable? Because I do think even right, like you just said, even right sizing can lead to, well, if we have 7 days, like we could add this thing, like we could pull this other part in, make this bigger. And that's not the intent, right? Our intent is on flow, moving things through the system as quickly as possible. So I think I use the term like your oh shit level, right? But if you think of your SLE as nothing should get this old, that's really how I like to use it. I had one team that called them stale stories, and they had a JIRA filter on their board that was like, show us everything that's stale. So show us everything that's past this number of days old on the board. And that's what they did stand up around first. So they would filter everything else off the board, because the only thing that matters right now for us to drive action to is the stuff that's aging past this reasonable threshold. So.
Sounds like your banana story, Fred.
My banana story. My mind just went blank.
A rotten banana?
Didn't you show me the bananas pinned to old stories, and then you could really see as they rotted and became browner and browner. It was a real physical cue to say, oh, that story is getting really old. We should do something about that.
I think I've seen it. Yeah, absolutely. That's good. That's another great tip about how you can bring stuff back to your team. Hey, Mike,
can I jump in with a real quick comment on right sizing? So there's some really good stuff that Daniel Vacanti and Pratik Singh have done in the YouTube channel, which is Drunk Agile, where they talk about this quite actively. So I recommend going and watching and reading up on that.
Good plug. Thanks, Mike.
Great,
all right. We had a couple people drop out of the queue. Feel free to jump back in the queue with questions if you're still here. But up next we have Eric.
Yeah, hi guys. So what I'm curious about, Colleen, is how, transitioning teams away from the story point mindset, that seems like almost intractable, right? So what are your tips for helping teams transition into this newer mindset of flow metrics? And, before I was laid off, one of the things I was doing at my company here in Skykick is I was starting to look at flow metrics and comparing it against what we had with story points, and it was a revelation in a lot of ways. I think management would be very open to this, because the flow metric seems to be just a way to break down story points into what they really are, right? Really put some actionable items on what is vague and complex and very hard to explain to the C-suite. So what are your suggestions with starting to transition teams into this new way of thinking things with probabilistic forecasting, which, by the way, I really appreciated how you used weather is, that imagery is key. That's going to help that concept stick in people's minds.
Yeah, so I think, well, and alongside the weather example, there's a talk that Dan Vacanti has done. Him and Pratik both live in South Florida, so they like to use hurricane modeling and forecasting for this example. Which, thinking about what's your risk tolerance, it's probably very different if you live in South Florida, right? I live in Denver, so my risk tolerance for the hurricane forecast being accurate or inaccurate is very different. But to answer your question, I think a great place to start is to be able to show both side by side. I try to, we all, whatever the thing is, we hold on to the things that we've been doing for a long time very tightly. And so I think if you can introduce this as just a starting point for like, hey, let's gut check our forecasts that we're doing now against this other way, that's using our past data. I think you have to be very careful with cycle time. People feel like you are telling them they're working too slow, right? And like I said, I've tried to introduce these metrics with a lot of teams where the first reaction I get when we look at cycle time data is, that's wrong. Like that's not how long it takes us to do work. That's impossible. Or you pull up one story and it's like, oh, it looks like this story took us 45 days to complete. Anybody have any ideas what's wrong? And if Fred was working on it, he's like, well, why are you calling me out? Here's all this other stuff I didn't have control over. Screw you, Colleen. Like, it's not my fault. So I think you have to be really careful when you're starting to introduce these things, that you're not putting people on the defensive, but you're introducing it as a way to say, here's another way that we could be looking at our forecasting. Maybe leave cycle time out for now. Just look at that throughput data and run the Monte Carlos and say, okay, here's our story points. Here's our velocity. Here's the date we came up with. Hey, I tried this other way of doing this based off our throughput data. Here's what it's giving me. One is telling me August, the other is telling me November. Let's talk about this, right? Use it as a conversation starter with your team. It takes a while, I think, for the teams to get bought into this, but I've seen just as many organizations use this in a bad way as they may use story points in a bad way, right? Or comparing teams, trying to compare teams' velocity in a bad way. I had one company that we were trying to introduce Monte Carlo, and they were like, well, every developer should be able to get one story done every day. So redo the model with 55 stories being completed every day. And I was like, that's not how this works, right? This is past data and not what you wish was happening. So all metrics can go wrong, I think. So I would just start with, if you want to have the conversation around forecasting first, start there. And then maybe instead of introducing cycle time, if you feel like that's going to be a rough conversation, introduce work item age as a way to say, hey, I just want to have a different conversation at stand up every day around the work that might be stuck in our system. So let's give this a try for a sprint and see how it goes.
Cool. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I love the framing of these things as exactly as Colleen was saying. The data points, they are things that we can use to alter our trajectory based on what we learn. Us against the problem. Given what we're seeing here, what will we do as a consequence? Not about singling anyone out, but what will we do with this information? How will it influence us achieving what we want to achieve? I think that's all of the questions.
Mike has a question.
Mike, final question.
Let's try and unmute. So previously, I'd find that when you were doing estimates, you get involved in conversations with middle managers, senior managers, where they started pushing you and go, well, couldn't we achieve this in a week? Couldn't we do this sooner? And probabilistic forecasting, I'm finding at times, I still kind of get the same thing. I just get it in a different way now. Oh, you said there's an 85% chance that we could sort of finish this amount of work by that time. Well, couldn't we just bring it in if we were prepared to accept more risk? As though senior managers were accepting the risk and the team weren't accepting the risk. But you know that the team are going to accept the consequences because they're going to turn into promises rather than probabilistic forecasts. Do you find that at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where if you can focus this on what are those few things, right? What are the things that are going to impact a forecast? And then what are the ways that we can manage the risk? That's all something, we talk about that iron triangle of project management of scope, time, money, right? And that's a language I think a lot of executives still think in. And so it's like, if you want this date to stay the same, and you want the probability of hitting the date to increase because you're trying to mitigate that risk, then one of these other things needs to change, right? Our capacity to do the work needs to increase, our speed needs to increase, or our scope needs to decrease. And I think that that's getting on their level with, from a language perspective, around what action can we take to manage the likelihood of hitting a specific date or keeping the scope the same.
Yes, I certainly tend to find that it's an improvement, but it's by no means a silver bullet, because you're still dealing with people and all of the idiosyncrasies that people come with.
The process is easy. People are the hard part.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So let's give Colleen some love with all those amazing reactions and sounds we've got. It's been a great session, folks. So that's the one I was looking for. Everyone, nice, good work. What I'd love to do is just do a quick temperature check. What have you learned from today? What's a takeaway from your perspective?
Story points may be going out of style.
True story. There should be a poll appearing on your screen, so feel free to type those in and we can see from your perspective. Story points are already out of style, yeah. Butter is cool, true story. Somebody wants to try Actual Agile and experiment with Monte Carlo. Introduce it correctly, yeah. Great insights. Okay, and your return on your time invested, it'd be great to hear from your perspective. Has this been a great use of your time? 1 is the worst use of your time, 5 is the best use of your time, and 3, you're sat on the fence, balancing like scales. So let us know how this has been from your perspective. All feedback welcome, of course.
Not to color the results, but this was a great use of my time. I love this. I'm excited. It was so amazing and insightful, and got to bring it back slowly to my teams, though. Don't want to beat them over with new ways of working too quickly.
Yeah, this was super helpful. Thank you. I can't actually vote because it won't let me scroll down as far as I need to, and I'm worried I'm going to click the wrong one. It was not the worst use of my time, definitely not.
No drama, all good. Thank you anyway. Now, a couple of other things. We wouldn't be able to run these meetups without our wonderful sponsors. You will see these sponsors shown throughout the various parts of Butter today. But you can see here we've got Butter. This is the platform some of you are particularly enjoying. You can benefit from a 7-day free trial using it and a 30% off your first 3 months subscription. It is a great alternative to Teams and Zoom for bringing the engagement and bringing all of the tools you need as a facilitator inside a single platform. So links will be appearing in the chat now for you to take advantage of some of the great offers from our sponsors. And we have Agile Testing Days. They are a great series of conferences across the world. There's a few in the US, there's a few in Europe. They've just finished their On the Beach edition in Cologne, and their next one's in Potsdam, Germany, which I'll be speaking at in November. And last of all, I am a trainer. Some of you may be aware, I deliver Scrum Mastery training over 6 months rather than those standardized 2-day courses, and you can benefit from a 10% discount off my next one with the code SMP10. You can get that on my website. Otherwise, we really appreciate you attending. And for your awareness, our next 4 sessions are looking a little bit like, where has it gone? There. Voila. So I'm up next, July 11th, sharing about the use of AI in the Agile space. We then have David Pereira talking about untrapping product teams. We've got Julie Starling, and we have Trisha Broderick in the summer also. So do look out for those upcoming events. We look forward to seeing one of those. Thank you for your questions, your engagements. Thank you for Fred for hosting us this evening. Thank you for Colleen for your great session. And yeah, we'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Oh, what a sad noise to end the session. Let's get some more celebratory noises. Oh, to unlock the secret ones.
Bingo. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.